Okay. So, so we don't want to spend the rest of the evening here, so I'll make it brief. We'll see. Perhaps I don't. So, when talking about choice, balanced choice, right? So, a few fundamentally important aspects are, of course, let's talk about first what is balanced, right? A multiplayer game is balanced if a reasonably large number of options available to the player are viable, actually. So it means the choices that you have actually make sense. You don't have choices for the sake of choices, but they actually do something in the game, are viable. And they are not limited to doing high-level play by experts, meaning it should work across all player levels, right? From low skill to medium to high skill, right? So if you just write a game for experts only, you can do that, but it's probably most likely something, a very specialized niche professional game, if you like. Yeah? But if you, for example, write a poker game, I don't know, whatever, you need to have an option that allows a beginner player to also get, some insight, perhaps by the accidental cheating on the part of the other players or something like this. So only then you kind of establish a truly balanced game. That's at least the idea. If you have a multiplayer role. So one of the things is, of course, you shouldn't have dominant strategies. What are dominant strategies? How do you think about it? Yep.
A strategy that always wins.
Exactly, right? So it's like an algorithm, basically. Well, if you do this in this order, you will always win, right? So it's like in chess. If you move this figure first, and this figure, and this, if you wrote it all down, and you would always win, this would be considered a dominant strategy, right? So, of course, they are rare, but they exist, right? So it's kind of, think about like a bug in a game, possibly, a dominant strategy. But this is something you want to eradicate, of course, from the get-go, right? So, yeah. So, and again, large number of options, that's the essence here, in many ways to win, not just one or two simple ways, right? Of course, depends on the game. If you think puzzle again, there's only one way to win, right? So that's not magic. But if you think about a player game, especially multiplayer game, there needs to be a bit of multiple options as well. And of course, you need to deal with choice and the wish of a player, right? So much choice you give a player. Every time I order pizza, right? So I have this issue there. They have 20 or 25 different pizzas, and I really can't choose anymore, right? So there is somewhere my choice in there, my preferred choice, but it's impossible to choose. If you were to reduce my choice to, let's say, to exactly 2, then I would be very happy, right? So then it makes it very easy to choose my desired pizza. So it really depends on the individual, of course, how good you are of dealing with complexity of multiple choices and so on, right? So again, the game needs to accommodate this, and the choices still need to make sense. They need to affect the game. If you're just making choices for the sake of choices, cool. Today I'm wearing a blue overall, tomorrow an orange one. If it doesn't make any difference in the game, then it's kind of pointless, right? So, but if it does, for example, visibility, right? Suddenly your enemy sees you better. Orange is suddenly inferior. Then the choice makes sense. Yeah, even though it has a negative effect, of course. To talk a bit more of choice and options, and to give you a bit of a different perspective on that one. I will show you a slightly oldish video. It's actually 10 years old. You guys know that? Yeah. Everyone knows that? No. Shall I risk and play it? It's actually quite fun, right?
It's fun still.
It's still fun, right? It's nearly 10 years old, but it's actually quite cool because it's a good overview of difference between choice and problems. So it's quite neat. See where it actually goes. I'll crank it up.
Hey again, my name is this, and we're still talking about these. Anyway, today I'd like to introduce the first entry in a series I like to call Game Design Corner, or GDC. Wait, hang on. Well, I'll think of a good name for it later. The inner workings of game design and development seem to be shrouded in mystery sometimes. It's not like film. It's not like every game comes with a special disc of bonus materials describing the process. So I thought to myself, hey, we've got a real live game designer with us here, and I figured it'd be fun to get an inside look at the sort of things they spend all day thinking about, other than industry-wide layoffs, of course. So let's get started. Mr. James Portnow, what have you got for us? All right, thank you. Sit down. Go on. Okay, what do we got here? The problem of choice. All right, this looks interesting. Thanks, James. All right, let's get to it. Let's start by laying down a few basics. Game design is all about designing decisions. As a game designer, you are crafting a series of decisions for a player to make, and that chain of decisions makes up the gameplay experience. This is the core of game design, and it's one of the first things they teach you as a game designer. But what they usually don't teach you is that decisions come in two forms: problems and choices. It's easy to mix the two up. Even veteran game designers will often just use the terms haphazardly, usually referring to every decision as a choice. But they're not the same thing, and this Oh, man, come on, do I have to read this part? Well, it just sounds pretentious. All right. This linguistic confusion is holding back our medium. Because problems and choices are two distinct ideas, and they're both fundamental to the craft of game design. So how are we supposed to define these two words? Here's the simplest way to say it. Problems direct a player towards a goal. Choices let the player choose their goal. Let's have a closer look at these two. First up, problems. Any decision you have to make in a game that has a best answer, or solution, is a problem, not a choice. The easiest examples to spot are the math problems that many games are riddled with. For example, in World of Warcraft, deciding what gear to wear is a problem, not a choice. Why is that? Because for any single objective in World of Warcraft, there is one set of gear that is the absolute best choice for the job. Gear in World of Warcraft is really a big puzzle when you think about it. It's a fun and complicated puzzle, and not one that always has an obvious solution, but a puzzle just the same. Another example, first-person shooter gameplay. It's all about problem solving. There's no free will involved here. You know exactly what your objective is, and choosing to not fight your opponent is not even an option. Pretty much any time the player is presented with a clearly defined goal, and the fun or challenge is in executing or achieving that goal, that's an example of a problem. So then what about choice? Choices are when you're asked to decide between things of equal or incomparable value. Deciding between an apple and an orange, roses or lilies, blue alien sex or the local flavor. These are all choices. Now, real choices tend to be much harder to design than problems, because they don't have a clear right answer. They also tend to be much harder to fit into games because, well, giving players too many options expands the size of the game very quickly. Remember how in some older games a character would ask you a question like, "Do you accept this mission?" And you're kind of an ass, so you chuckle and select, "No." But then the character just replies, "Har, no really, do you accept this mission?" These games gave you the thin illusion of choice. The designers weren't going to program an entirely different game where you sit around in town all day, sipping coffee and hitting on the local women while reading in the newspaper about what the king's second choice of hero is up to. You see how just one single choice can lead to an immense workload? Choice can complicate things very quickly. And that's why you see way more problem solving in games than you see choice making. Now, this certainly isn't to say that problems are bad by any means. Most games are built on problem solving, and that's kind of how it should be. You'd be hard-pressed to find more than a handful of games that have been made without any problem solving at all. For that matter, there are tons of great games that don't feature a single choice. Problems are really at the heart of what we consider gaming today, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's important that we distinguish them from choices. Now, why does this matter at all? Because without distinguishing between the two, it's very easy to reduce choices to just being simple problems to solve. How many times has a game presented you with something that should be a choice, but instead was just a simple problem with a clear right answer? BioShock gave us a good recent example. What should have been an ambiguous moral choice in that game was reduced to a simple element of larger game problem solving. How? By tying that choice into other gameplay mechanics. Let me show you what I mean. Say you have to decide between an apple and an orange, which we would normally consider a choice. But say you know that an apple is worth $5 and an orange is worth 10, and the goal of the game is to get the most money. Deciding between those two is no longer a choice. It's basic problem solving. This is an issue we often run into with fake choices in games. When you attach rewards to choices that affect gameplay, the choice is often reduced to just being problem solving. Let's say a game offered you a choice. Will you help out this old man or ignore him? And you know the reward for being nice to him is a big stack of money, experience, or ammo, or whatever. But if you ignore him, you'll only get a little of that, if anything at all. That knowledge transforms this choice into a problem, and it's pretty automatic. You simply ask yourself, do I want that reward, or would I rather spend time doing other things? Helping the old man never even enters into the equation. You don't even think about it. And that's because we gamers often place the tangible benefit of solving problems over the more nebulous and work-intensive satisfaction of making a choice. Maybe this is something all people do. Or maybe it's a common trait amongst our kind. This doesn't mean we get more pleasure from solving problems, or that problem solving is a more fun activity. It simply means that reducing choices to problems is one of the easiest ways to approach them. If you give a player that option, that's probably what he's going to do. So again, why does this matter at all? If problem solving is the foundation on which games are built, why make such a fuss over choices anyway? Well, for two reasons. One, a game designer needs to be able to distinguish between these two to use them effectively. When you're building something, it's kind of important to understand the tools and materials you're working with. But there's an even bigger reason than that. I do a lot of talking here about games developing as an artistic medium, and this is another important key to that. In order to be an art, a medium must be able to address the human experience. And there's a huge range of human experiences that are better expressed as choices than problems to be solved. Because in life, a lot of the decisions we make don't have a right answer. Like choosing our career, choosing who to make friends with, what social circles to join. From small questions like, what do I want to wear today, to complex moral dilemmas like, is violence an acceptable means to do good? And isn't a dilemma like that much more compelling when it's a real choice you have to make, rather than a multiple choice question with an obvious answer? As an industry, we're trying to learn how to make our games more compelling. As an art, we're trying to learn how to make our games more expressive. The better game designers understand their tools, the better products they'll be able to create. It's just one more step in pushing games to new heights. And that concludes our first entry of Working Title. If you guys have enjoyed this look into the process of game design, be sure to let me know. This is definitely something we can do again. And let's hear a big thank you to James for sharing some thoughts on game design with us and giving us a little peek at what his job is about. If any of you have more questions about this topic, or game design in general, feel free to swamp his inbox with your thoughts. You can find his personal email address in the closing credits. If that's all right with him, of course. How's that? Speak out, James. He says it's okay.
So it's actually quite worthwhile watching. If you want to have a look, Daniel Floyd is the channels, and there's quite a number of those videos there. But it's actually quite a good way to express the issue, right? Difference between problems and choices and so on. How it accommodates real life. I guess that's quite relevant. So yes, talking a bit more about choice and risk associated with this. In the very beginning of the session, I mentioned that we have a built-in calculus that considers rewards and losses associated with probabilities, right? So the idea is there: is it possible, perhaps, to actually decouple this, right? So you have risk and reward. So is high risk always associated with high reward, right? Can you have different combinations? Because the risk is simply there that the passive play as low risk and low reward, but nevertheless reward, could be kind of a dominant strategy in the long term. So that's something that's be mindful about. So especially for players that are actually taking risk, is the game still balanced for those kind of players, right? That's really the challenge there. And perhaps it's sometimes worthwhile to have a low risk, high reward, and then randomly splatter in a high risk, low reward kind of activity as well. So it should not necessarily be this clear distinction between risk and reward that's existing there. So another aspect, going outside of the challenge and challenge perspective, is the differentiation between knowledge and skill. So, it's cognition and skill to some extent. So, for example, if you're puzzle solving, right? So there's oftentimes, there was just the example of mathematical puzzles or maths style puzzles, if you like. So that would be more on the cognition side, of course. But it's also worthwhile thinking about how do you get the game balance in both perspectives, right? So in role-playing games, they kind of got there slowly, right? So we have kind of a mix of activity, which is more focused on precision, your skill level associated with this, and then intermittent quizzes that are to be solved and so on, right? So, but this is also a form of balancing, of course, right? Thinking about different stereotypes, personas of players that you can satisfy or want to address in your game, right? So, unless you really want to be niche in your game approach. So, and we find that more and more that games are actually kind of intermittent, sit in between there, and are no longer hard and fast either or, more and more. I mean, it doesn't mean that you still don't have purely dexterity-focused games, meaning just skill-based games in the high distance. So, yeah, the thing is there, hygiene factor means basically what's the trade-off, right? So what's the optimal solution? Again, you need to figure out your kind of typical player persona, get those as playtesters and have them play the game, and then figure out by qualitative assessment interviews as to which direction the game should drift or not. So that's worthwhile bearing in mind because it's not so obvious when you think about balance, for example. Length and cooperation, I mentioned that before. So sometimes it's worthwhile figuring out what kind of game you're actually playing. Is there a possible opportunity to perhaps combine those? So generally the idea is that either you have a cooperation game where you to some extent need to collaborate to get stuff done, teamwork, right? SWAT team things. Or competition, right? So we have simulation worlds where we actually play different kind of enemies and so on, need to fight each other. But isn't there an option that you can merge those two ones at times so that you actually have individual benefit from collaboration for a time frame, and then, for example, go back into competition, if you like, right? So, those are all the kind of modeling decisions you can make, because suddenly someone else's high skill level can be to your benefit if you're in a cooperative situation, whereas at the same time you may actually drag them down and so on. So the whole balance can actually be skewed if you have a especially a spot cooperation, where you only situationally cooperate against the bigger evil. You guys were mentioning this football game again, where you basically have two possibly human players could theoretically play against a computer or something like that, hypothetically. So that would be one way where you can actually benefit from cooperation, even though being highly unbalanced in your skill set. Yeah, and other than that would be dealing with the length of the game. So if you're modeling your computational evidence, so that's going a bit social psychology, but I think it's one model that you could use probably. You guys know about competition cooperation and things like this, right? So, and in social psychology, there's a model that basically has to try to identify people, how we actually are, and in a social environment. And the idea is there, okay, how much do we care about others? And in a trade-off, how much do we care about ourselves? Right? So, and then we have the extreme cases, people that only care about themselves, actually don't care at all, they're indifferent about others. We would call them individualists, right? So high payoff for self, I want to maximize my payoff, actually don't care how much how you fare. You may be good or bad or whatever, right? It's fairly indifferent about it. But there may also be a competition situation that you, for example, want a high payoff for yourself, but at the same time you do minimize the other one's payoff. Right? So you're from the game dev studio and you want to get rid of your competition. Easy, you enter in competition, you lower prices, for example, right? Suddenly you lose out, so meaning you are no longer at your maximum earnings, the maximum payoff, but at the same time the pain for the other one is higher, right? So that's the key idea there. So, it's usually happening when companies enter a new market that you tighten up competition, prices will drop, even though temporarily often. On the other end of the scheme, of course, you have cooperation, that you actually kind of optimize for the best possible outcome for yourself and the other person, right? So that would be classical cooperation games. Extreme case altruism, you only care about others, not yourself. That's pretty, it's kind of the complement of individualism in a way. And then things like martyrdom, where you actually give up yourself more or less proactively. Masochism, where it's kind of really, proactively against yourself apparently. And so on, all the different forms that you can probably allocate along the scheme. What I want to get at here is, this could be a starting point for having a probabilistic model, how you model cooperative players, right? So you have multiple computer players, AI, basically, and human players. How could you model cooperation between those or not, right? By having some sort of probabilities attached to it. For example, probabilities between value 0 and 1, and then calculating the distribution based on what type of player or what type of AI you're actually dealing with. Question now: in human societies, where do we the most commonly measured traits are competitive, individualistic, and cooperative traits. The other ones are a bit harder to measure in a way. Where do we sit as humans? What do you think our distribution is? What are we mostly? Are we more here, more here, more here? Please.
What means distribution?
Oh, right, that's a good question. That's absolutely right. So out of, let's say, the global population to some extent, it's how representative is the question, but think about the global population, okay, how many, what's the fraction of people that is more cooperative in their thinking? So they're actually caring about others as well as their own at the same time. How many people are individualistic? They only care about themselves, but don't care about others. So that means they not necessarily want to harm others, they're just indifferent about them. They're just, good luck, right? Classical IT person. Anyway, and then there's the competition, of course, where you have, you want to drive, the other one's demise to some extent. What do you think, where we sit as a society? There were some studies. Any guesses? Percent.
Yourself or like?
No, as a society. So it's what's the fraction of the entire society that, for example, operates more under this competitive scheme, right? So, how many percent? Just a guess. There's no right. Well, there's a right and wrong, but it doesn't matter. Put it this way. Guesses?
Something like 30-30 on cooperation and competition, maybe.
So equal distribution amongst all the three, roughly.
Slightly higher on individualism.
Okay, slightly higher here, and the rest is balanced. That's what you. Yeah, cool.
I would say absolutely most are individualism with like a dash of cooperation only for like specific people, and then maybe 20 or less are competition.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Yep.
I assume that the most of people are actually in cooperation layer,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know, about 15% for individualism and competition.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yep. So you're saying, okay, the weight is here and the rest is somewhat equally distributed there. Cool. Yep. Anyone else? Other ideas? Covered quite some ground there already. So of course, those studies, you know, they have a certain bias, of course, right? The populists, they actually explore, but the observation was basically roughly like this, that actually predominantly people are in general cooperative. So like your intuition basically is supported. And the natural drive towards competition only exists in the case of need, right? So if we're actually fighting for resources, scarce resources. Other than that, we wouldn't necessarily be competitive, meaning minimizing the other's well-being. Again, that's different from individualism, where we care about the maximization of our well-being, indifferent of the other's outcome. So, but anyway, it's just for the sake of interest. That's so it's not too bad after all. That's always kind of lifts the hope for human society in a way. Anyway, so it's just an idea about how you could approach modeling, for example, a behavior of AI or of humans, right? If you have a persona and you want to see, okay, how do you, how could you operationalize in a program that behavior if you want to test it or something, or want to build an AI from it, basically. Yeah, so rewards, of course, reasonably diverse, the kind of stuff you can get, right? So usually it's based on psychology, what works best for people. Probably I forgot to mention playtest down here, because you need to ask the people what actually work best for them in a particular game. But it's usually like giving them stuff, right? Like points, of course. More and more items nowadays, so it's a bit more in. Power comes with status, so that is usually also a good one to have. Resources, of course, but it's very strictly linked to our more economic games, if you like. So at least where you have the risk of dying of starvation and things like this, then where the desire for the resource is particularly high. And yeah, sometimes it's also reward can be prolonging the game, right? So for example, if there's a timeout associated with this, getting a reward to extend the game before you actually, before the game is terminated is also costs some sort of reward. So there's different forms you can imagine, and you probably have seen most of those in some form or another, in a way. So, yeah, cool. Punishment similarly, right? So you have some issues when you lose. How do you represent it, right? You can have a character die, of course, but it's a very hard punishment, so you need to moderate that as well. Because if you just have high risk, it always means if you die at the end, then I'm not sure how long you keep that highly motivated player with you either. So it can be considerable in terms of removal of powers, points, or things like this. But more sophisticated would be social sanctioning, like shaming, for example. But think about, of course, also what is acceptable. So how can you express punishment in games without touching the personality of the player itself, right? So some people may be more susceptible to physical aggression that is suddenly a form of punishment in a game, not in real life. So that needs to be taken into account. Please, there's some comments. Please.
Yeah, I just saw the punishment that can work, like for example in a mystery game, is limiting what you can find.
Ah, right. So how does the player know that he's limited?
Well, you can have maybe if you're a proper police in your role as police, you can suddenly lose access.
Ah, right.
To places.
Yeah.
Certain things like that.
Yeah. So that is totally one of the. You're absolutely right. So it needs to be a conscious loss in a way, right? So if you know less about the unknown, or you have less access or lower probability of accessing the unknown, that probably will not be reflected as a punishment per se. But this is a perfect example. You have powers, you remove powers, right? So that's exactly one of those. So that's to be taken carefully. So rewards are usually easier. They are very consumable across cultures and preferences of individuals. Punishment can be quite tricky in games as well. So if you have, for example, horror game, you have blood splattering. So you don't need to push it here, I guess. Right. So another thing is about this is indirectly about balancing, but it relates to it. I just want to bear in mind in the earlier lecture, in the first lecture, in fact. Of this section of the course, we talked about the idea and how far the narrative is emergent. What the heck is the narrative thing again? What is the narrative of a game?
It's the
Yeah, right. So it's the development of the story throughout the game. You know, there's some other concepts that probably Richard will talk about associated with this. But actually, you know, what's the storyline basically, right? So, and there were two ways of doing it. You either have kind of a scripted storyline where you kind of the old step-fashion games. I mean, we just saw an example quite nice, right? Where you have the illusion of choice, but actually it's a scripted action. You don't have a choice but to say yes, of course, I will take that order and you know. Engage in that challenge and so on. But if you have emergent complexity, it's pretty hard to deal with balancing again, right? So at this stage, it's super important to do the game testing to actually see how different storylines actually play out in reality, right? Open world games would be one direction there, right? So we talked a bit about open world games and their oftentimes lack of engagement because in the end, you're just walking around randomly and doing stuff seemingly randomly and not so systematic. So you have emergent complexity, but it's not engaging. Right, so yeah. So in this case, probably having some more drive or ensuring that player actually ends up at the right quests or that quests are meaningfully ordered and sequentially executed may make more sense in order to have an interesting narrative, even though it's more scripted. So it's kind of a trade-off as well. So yeah, I think this is Elegance. Yeah. So. This goes wider. Yeah, it's probably a bit more of a design perspective as well, if you like. How oftentimes do actually sometimes simplicity is better than complexity in a game. So unnecessary choices should be removed, but that's one of the key messages of this idea here, being somewhat elegant and being focused on what the game is actually about. Here, the example of the iPhone is quite interesting in the sense that you, of course, focus on technology primarily, but why do people buy iPhones? Oftentimes not for technological reasons. That's similar for games as well. So you kind of need to focus on what your game is actually about and not get lost in the mechanics underneath it. So that's one of the messages here. And then the final thing that perhaps I should touch upon is, or one of the final things is having deep games. So rock, paper, scissors. Yes, what is a deep game? Please, you have some comment.
For the previous slide.
Previous slide, please, and enlighten me.
What the game is really about. What is the game really about? Like a good example of this game really is about that. Do you have an example of that?
Ah, right. Yeah. So, for example, if you have a game in which you construct something, right? So, and you basically just end up with the objective of that's focused on aesthetic. Where it's not so much really about the gameplay per se, but just about producing something. Yeah, I don't have a, what is a good, guys, if form follows function, that's the key idea, the motivation behind it, kind of a Bauhaus philosophy. What's a good game that does that? We actually remove unnecessary bells and whistles just to get stuff done. Minecraft is the example for that. Exactly, perfect, right? So you have the basic mechanics, very good, thank you. 4 o'clock, right? So you have the basic mechanics, but the aesthetics have been, in this case, are kind of secondary, right? So because low poly and not, necessarily super appealing, but the gameplay is, incredibly high, and the idea of combining constructionism with gameplay is, pretty cool. So it's purely focused on function with very crude aesthetics associated with this. Yes, so thank you very much. That was good, very helpful. The other thing is, of course, deep gameplay. So deep gameplay is really about if you have nested stories, for example. Again, emergent narratives. So if you take a particular choice in a game, a pathway, then suddenly a new storyline unfolds, right? Which is basically a nested challenge that you need to perform in an open world setting and so on. And once you return to the main storyline again, things like this, right? So that would be the idea of deepening games. And this would generally be good as an option. So it's a good way of balancing, because people can either choose to go down a more complex pathway or stay on a simple main storyline level in this one. So it would be one way. For example, if you combine a racing game with some, GTA could be one of those, if you like, right? So you can actually choose the pathway to some extent, how deep you want to go in terms of doing actually the missions as opposed to doing basic racing activities. Okay, I leave out the poker, yeah, poker, so, okay. Yeah, this is kind of the form follows function thing. The idea is that poker is not necessarily really about playing per se, but rather about thinking about other players. So, so it's not really, it's a different style of game. So again, the magic is not in the design, the magic is about the psychology, meaning the metaphor of the narrative. But one thing that's important in terms of keeping people engaged, I think, and that's something I should apply more often here myself, is to know when to end, right? So if you have a situation where one player is clearly dominant, the other one is inferior, then it's probably sensible to actually, make the inferior player give up by whatever means, right? So not to artificially prolong the game or drag it out, or you need to look for the last figure somewhere in the top left of the map and actually kill her or him before you actually can win the game, right? So so checkmate in chess is a good one for that one, of course, right? So the story is told and things are kind of done. So you're right. So without further ado, I think I I just point to game economics. So of course, if you build game economies like simulation games richer, where you have resources, capabilities, individuals, multi-parties, and so on, you actually should be inspired by economics itself. And there's a quite good book from Adams on game mechanics that has a good section about economics as well. So if you want to build like complex world simulations, it actually gets very involved. Balancing is no longer as simple, or it's by no means simple anymore. So that's the challenge there. And one word of warning, just to leave you with this one, is players learn as well. So if you do auto adaptation of the game to player skills, players will in return learn that the game does that and play accordingly, right? So auto balance oftentimes not a good idea either. So I'm sure if Richard will say something about this, because he has, I think, played around with this. But it's of course a challenge that needs to be dealt with as well. And that's it. So pretty much the rest is about playtesting, right? So everything you do, if you think about strategies, and there's so many different flat categories we looked at, test it, whatever you do, right? So test for the sensitivity of option, test that options actually have impact on the gameplay, differentiate between what is a problem, meaning a necessity to be solved to achieve a goal, as opposed to a true choice in a game. And yeah, again, just ensure that it's properly tested. There are some tools out there to do that. For example, Machinations. Did anyone have a look at this tool? Probably can bring it up perhaps next week or something like this to briefly show you. So basically you can input probabilities and the game operations, and it shows how balanced the game actually is. But of course it works based on random number generator fundamentally, and in fact when you do playtesting you need to have the persona. Did you learn about personas in the experience design course earlier? Yes, right? They do it in design as well. They have a target group. You have a similar thing for games, of course. Different characteristics, but fundamentally the same thing: age, occupation, background, blah, blah, and things like this, right? So, and those you would subject to some playtesting, do evaluation, and then refine the game. So it's fundamentally the same there as well. Good. Okay. So thank you very much for your patience with me. Yep. So if you take something away from this playtesting, next week, Maish will continue on the Unity demo, if you like. So some of you noticed that the stream is not up, and the reason is there was some issue with the recording. He will re-record it at home as a screencast and then put it on YouTube, so you can still recover it from there. And he promised to do it the whole thing without swearing, so that's pretty good. So so it's a bit cleaner, and we're probably not flagged on YouTube. That's also good. So any one of you that actually has missed out on that tutorial, wait, be patient, and have a look, and then you'll have a chance to actually do the exercise. Cool. Thank you very much.